balance is not the most important thing in any given game. The most important thing is if you enjoy the game. Balance testing is probably the last 10 to 20% of the testing you do. And balance testing is the thing that people think of when they think of the word playtesting.
Right.
But balance testing is a minuscule part at the end of all of your testing.
Howdy friends, Craig here. Listeners hear me preach the quality of the design work that comes out of Steamforged games all the time. Several episodes ago, we had Jamie Perkins on the show, and today we have a former developer from that camp that shares some insights. Bryce Johnston covers so much in this interview, from design, development, trends in gaming, to really what makes a game good. He does a good job covering what he thinks the impacts of COVID are going to be in the short term and the long term for tabletop gaming. We have an interesting conversation about playtesting. He draws a distinction between being a game designer versus a game developer. I know a lot of you think they're one and the same. Stick around to the end. His discussion about representation in gaming, I think, is fascinating. Enjoy.
Playing a tabletop strategy game allows you to unplug and test your skills against friends. Every week, Third Floor Wars delivers useful strategies, discussions, battle reports, and reviews to tabletop games like Malifaux. If you want to get better at the games you already play, or discover the games other people are playing, you are in the right place. Craig and Ray welcome you to the Third Floor and the Tabletop Talk broadcast.
Craig here on the Third Floor. Today we're talking to Bryce Johnston, the designer best known for his work on Dark Souls, the card game, and of course, Guild Ball. Now, listeners already know I'm a huge fan of Guild Ball. Guild Ball is what saved me from Games Workshop, and since then I've never looked back. So Bryce, welcome to the Third Floor.
Hello, it's a real pleasure to be here.
Well, it's good to have you, man.
Yeah.
So the question we give all new guests, and your good friend Jamie had to answer this as well, is there was a day, and it wasn't yesterday, but there was a day where Bryce had never seen a tabletop game before, had never seen a mini, never rolled a die. I want to know what happened that day when you first came across it. So how were you introduced to tabletop gaming?
So I was introduced when it was around 2004. So it was just after The Return of the King came out. And one day I was round at my friend at the time who we'd never heard of miniature gaming or anything. And he had just walked into a Games Workshop that day and bought the Warriors of Minas Tirith, I think, starter set. The ones that Games Workshop used to do where it came with the paint. And it came with like 8 little guys, and then you got the paints to paint them. And yeah. I saw those figures, and I just felt something inside my head go, yeah, this is going to be a problem. And then, so I got into the Lord of the Rings, and then Fantasy, and then 40K, and then War Machine, and then Guild Ball. So,
gotcha. That's a very common progression. I still argue to this day that Lord of the Rings is one of the better games that GW ever put out. Mm-hmm. I think really the only gap for that game where I ended up losing interest with it, because it wasn't the models were really nice, and the rules were pretty good. The problem was the wind condition. What ended up always, every game I ever played, a match game, right? Not a scenario, but every match game I ever played, you just ended up with everybody piling up in the middle of the board and beating the hell out of each other.
Yeah.
Which is fun. But I always felt like that was the only thing missing there, was just something that kind of changed it up a little bit. But good game. I
don't know that I think in tournament play, because Jamie Giblin, who I was about to say I used to work with, he played a lot of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game over the last kind of 10 years, I think. And apparently in tournaments, it's all sort of scenario based, and there are actually scenarios that kind of shake that up a little bit, which sounds really good, because you're right, that was always one of the big weaknesses in standard play, as it were.
Right. Yeah. And I admit that I mean, I haven't played the game in 10 years, so I'm sure a lot has happened. There's a whole new edition out since I last played. So the progression from Lord of the Rings to fantasy, very natural, fantasy and 40K, very natural. But then there's the jump, which is leaving GW for Privateer Press and getting into War Machine. What caused that to happen?
So that was because we were essentially at the time there was myself and a group of players that I grew up with essentially, and one of them had been sort of chatting to people online and sort of hearing about War Machine, and at the same time we'd been playing competitive 40k and going to tournaments for it, and we actually went to I think like the second ever Nova Open or something in 2011. Like
Wow.
I was, I think 19, maybe 20, and the three of us flew over and we went and played Nova Open, and that was when we actually, ironically, even though we went to play 40k, we ended up getting to know a lot of the War Machine players there, and we went to play 40k and left with about $70 worth of War Machine books, and then we all sat on the flight on the way back reading the War Machine books, and then we sort of never really looked back,
Yeah.
because I am by nature, when it comes to tournament game, like when it comes to gaming, I am by nature a very competitive tournament gamer. Or rather, I wasn't, and then I grew up with two people that were, and so my choices were get beat literally every game, or
Right.
get good enough to actually compete. And so I eventually got that good, and never really looked back because War Machine did that much better than 40k did for me. It provided the thing that I was looking for out of the game
Yep.
much better than 40k ever did.
Yeah, a much better rule set and far more built for competitive play. I think that I tend to get on GW a little bit more than I probably should, especially since the changes they've made recently. But I think that if you're playing 40k and AOS to have fun and throw dice and stuff like that, they're fantastic. They're really good, and you can't beat the lore and stuff like that. But I think if you are a competitive mindset and you come across something like War Machine, you're like, oh wow, there's a whole new world here.
Yeah, definitely.
So when you migrated to Guild Ball, was that a career decision? Was that you're getting tired of War Machine? Like, let's talk about that last jump there.
So it was a combination of definitely a career decision because I started playing Guild Ball in 2015. And at the time, I was like going to the World Team Championship for War Machine, and I was playing like near constant War Machine. And then in the tail end of 2015, Jamie Perkins approached me and said, "Hey, we knew each other a little bit through War Machine." He was like, "Hey, you have an English degree and you're good at English. We need a proofreader." Or I was originally what I came on, yeah. So I came on originally to be like a proofreader and a rules editor. And my credit to this day on the Guild Ball Season 2 rulebook is actually as an editor, not a developer. But once I started working with them, I very quickly started doing development work. And so I got the job at Steamforged in May 2016 officially, but I'd already been working for them for about 6 months, kind of on and off, as it were. And then, so that was May 2016, and then in I think July 2016, Mark III of War Machine dropped, and that mark suffered from a lot of, it was overhyped by Privateer Press because they made a very big deal about how it had been playtested for 3 years and it was going to be like incredibly balanced and X, Y, and Z, and they made a huge deal about it. And then when it came out, I remember laughing because there were a bunch of basic typos on a lot of the cards that they said they'd been testing for 3 years. And it turned out the game wasn't any more balanced than Mark II had been. It was just different stuff was powerful.
Right.
And so that really sort of precipitated a drop off in War Machine for me anyway. And at the time, the Guild Ball competitive scene was starting to get going. So I kind of jumped straight into that. And I kept playing War Machine until I think the end of 2017, I kept playing it for another year, maybe 2 years, but it became the kind of thing where instead of traveling to international tournaments, I was kind of going to local events and playing with a couple of people that I saw and not really getting more widely involved in the community. And Guild Ball straight up replaced that, where that was the game that I was all in on and I was playing all the time.
No, I never played War Machine, but from my understanding, Bryce, the thing about War Machine is you can't get behind, right? Like you have to stay very active. You have to stay on top of the shifting metas and the changes. Otherwise, you kind of get left in the dust. I've always got the impression that meta knowledge of the entire line can be a huge factor in your win-loss percentage.
So yeah, there was a thing that we used to say back when I played War Machine super competitively, which was, no matter how bad your enemy Warcaster, which is like your Guild Ball captain.
Yep.
The Warcaster is the equivalent of War Machine. No matter how bad the enemy Warcaster is, the first time you play against it, you'll probably lose. Because every Warcaster, even the worst ones, have a trick. They have one thing they can do well. And if you don't know how to counter that thing, you'll probably lose. And every time after that, you're like, oh no, I know this now, it's fine. And War Machine, so in-depth knowledge of the game has always been very important.
Yeah.
But that has gotten a lot worse with the arrival of Mark III and with community integrated development, which is essentially Privateer Press are throwing stuff out to the community to engage with and to publicly test. And the problem is they're doing like 3 of these or 4 of these a year. And so they're literally errating huge sections of the game every 3 or 4 months, plus new releases, of course. Like there's still new stuff coming out of it. And War Machine was already a big game at the start. Like even going into Mark III, War Machine was already huge. And so now it's interesting you say that, because I was talking to one of my friends earlier who hasn't been able to play for 6 months because of COVID. And he's like, I already feel behind and no one's been able to play because of COVID, but it's been 6 months and there have been changes and releases, and it's so much. And that's someone that's played the game since 2013, I think. And now that he's had to take 6 months out, he's like, I don't know if I can get back into this, because the mental load is so exhausting for War Machine.
Yeah, and that becomes a real barrier. Part of the reason why I found Guild Ball and started straying from 40K is I had kind of gotten lax about keeping track of changes in 40K. A new edition had come out, and I didn't immediately buy it and play it. And I sat down and played a game with somebody, and I was not on top of the rules. And I got so frustrated because the kind of player I am is I like to know the rules. I like to be the person in the room that everybody goes, hey, Craig, how does this work? And that's just how I am. And that's part of my enjoyment of the game is understanding the mechanics, right? And I got behind on 40. I can't imagine though how frustrating that must be for your buddy and for anybody losing that. And it'll be interesting, and it's something we'll kind of talk about a little bit here in a bit, that'll be interesting for the future of the game. Yeah. Because I bet his feelings are not alone in feeling out of it and not on top of it. So one of the things we've been doing with this Insider Insight series is it's my chance to talk with game designers and industry insiders from all over the world. Now, Bryce recently has started a podcast called An IAYE for Games. And today we're going to dig into not only his thoughts on the tabletop gaming landscape, but I also want to learn about the next jump from editor to game designer. And I want to get an idea of what his thoughts and approaches are to game design. So Bryce, we're in an interesting time for tabletop gaming right now. Board games continue to do well, and they've been doing well for a long time. I think the Euro board games, maybe about a dozen years ago, really started to become prominent. And now you can go to Target and buy Settlers of Catan, right? We still see new card games coming out that are doing well, like the new Marvel one is doing very well. And then you've got Magic the Gathering, which has been around as long as I've been in gaming. You've got GW engaging the community in a whole new way. You've got big companies like Cool Mini or Not is putting out actual mini games, not board games. But smaller companies like Weird, Corvus Bell, Steamforged, they're Privateer Press. The smaller guys are still putting out new things. But a lot's changed, and we kind of hinted at it. And I would be interested to know what you think the pandemic is doing to gaming now. And I'd like to know whether you think there'll be a hangover, whether you think that what we're seeing now may not be completely temporary.
So what the pandemic's having a number of different effects on gaming, and it's not having an effect equally over the whole tabletop gaming industry. So to break it down a little bit, for instance, RPGs are booming right now. Because RPGs, you can jump on a Skype call and you can play an RPG with your friends. And that actually, I know a lot of people who are literally doing that purely because it helps them keep in touch with friends because of COVID. And so RPGs are doing really well, but I don't know how much they're actually selling, because RPGs have always had that issue of one person buys a rulebook and they DM 25 people off it. And so that industry, like D&D is always going to make money, but I wonder if the smaller companies are going to start getting like a little bit hurt by that. But then you've also got like online PDFs and people. There does seem to be a sort of nice move in RPGs and smaller companies generally to stuff like putting stuff up on drive-through and basically saying like, hey, you don't have to buy this, it's free, but please, this helps me pay rent. Please give me a little bit of money towards it. So I think that's what a lot of smaller companies will do. But in general, RPGs, good, doing very well right now. The pandemic ultimately has benefited them in terms of more people are playing RPGs than ever.
Yep.
Card games, I think, is a really interesting one, because we were already seeing prior to COVID a shift to online card games. So Magic the Gathering is one you mentioned. They've made a big shift towards MTG Arena. And for instance, Age of Sigmar Champions, which kind of died physically prior to this already, but they've seen a little bit of a resurgence online. There are a bunch of other examples. I know there was one, it's like Monster Train or something that my friend DC worked on recently. And so this does seem to be the future of card games. And I think card games were already heading in that direction, but COVID has really accelerated that move, because it means you can play from home. It means you don't have to go down a gaming store on a Friday night and do Friday Night Magic with 100 other plague carriers. And so I think, generally speaking, card games will, for the foreseeable, because there's a lot of other benefits to moving online. Like, your costs are a hell of a lot lower. You don't have to worry about outdated, like game stores don't have to worry about carrying outdated stock, because they're not going to have the Magic cards from 2 cycles ago just sitting, taking up space in a stock room. Yep. And also, it's kind of interesting, because I played a bunch of Age of Sigmar Champions online at the start of the pandemic, because it was a game I played physically when it first came out, and then the communities for it sort of died in my area, and I kind of never really bothered getting back into it. But then when the pandemic hit and I was put on furlough, I was like, I have literally nothing but time, and this game is technically free to play. Yep. So inevitably I spent money on it. So yeah, I spent like 20 quid or something to get a decent deck. And one thing that I really realized playing that was, because that game relies on a lot of card moving and a lot of wound tokens and counters and numbers going up and down, much the same as Magic has your life total and mana and all that sort of thing. That's so much better online.
Yeah. Like,
it's so much easier. Like, you just, instead of going, right, so it's the start of my turn, I do this, I do this, I do this. You take 5 damage, and then like someone gets a roll wrong because there's a precise timing method that you've screwed up because you kind of just did it all at the start of your turn. You just click a button and the computer does it, and you're like, oh, great, cool. And so that kind of paradoxically leads to, not paradoxically, I guess, but it leads to way less downtime and way less scorekeeping and way less sort of messing about, really. And
less bookkeeping.
Bookkeeping, thank you. That is clearly the word I was trying to remember. And so I think that's going to be the future of card games. And we already saw it with Hearthstone. Like, that's always been a virtual card game, and it's always done very well. And I think that's where card games are going in the future. And COVID has made that all but an inevitability at this point, I would say.
So what scares me about that, because I don't disagree with you, Bryce, but what scares me about that is that's what keeps the local game stores open,
Yeah.
is selling cards. Now, our local store, we have three big ones here in the Raleigh area, which we're very lucky to have them. And my main one that I go to, they're still open. I know people that work there. They still are getting their hours. People are coming in and people are spending money with them. But I don't know how sustainable it is long term. Have you noticed anything as far as local game stores around you?
So local game stores around me, they're all shut at the moment. Element Games is the biggest one, which I imagine everyone has seen ads for online if you
Yep.
have ordered from them. Element Games is my local gaming store. It is a 15 minute drive from where I live. They were open very briefly while the lockdown restrictions were eased in England about, God, like a month ago or so. But since then, Manchester's had another local lockdown, and so no, like gaming stores around here are just shut.
Yeah.
However, one thing I do know is that gaming stores generally are doing pretty well on online sales. So any gaming store that's invested in online sales is doing pretty well at the moment. However, if they haven't invested in online sales, they're they're going to struggle pretty
Yeah,
hard.
they're going to shut down,
Yeah,
quite frankly.
yeah,
I mean, the margin on them is so small to begin with.
yeah.
I mean, they struggle to begin with. I just don't know how deep their pockets could be.
Yeah, I mean, gaming stores are almost always run as a labor of love. Like
Yep.
it's someone runs a gaming store and they pay themselves probably minimum wage, but they do it because they enjoy running a gaming store. And yeah, I there's a lot of industries that are going to get hit. Anything like I know there's been a lot of problem with arts funding and stuff, particularly in the UK. Like a lot of my friends who worked in theaters or bands, or like I have a few friends who are stand-up comedians, and they are just like, I don't know when I can work again. Yeah,
Yeah.
like so they're all having to go back to do just their day jobs, and this is just going to wreck their career. And I think gaming stores absolutely fall into that. Any place that is designed primarily to allow people to congregate, you're struggling right now because cannot congregate currently. And I think this will lead to an overall change, not for the whole of society, but certainly for a large chunk of society. Even once this ever goes away, which we don't know if it is at the moment, it's never going to go back to normal. I
Yeah.
don't think, unless there is a vaccine and the vaccine works 100% of the time and everyone can get it for very cheap, and that's it. This is never going to go back to normal.
Well, and it's also assuming we don't have something else similar
Yeah,
happen, right?
yeah,
Which I don't think is talked about enough, is that this is not the only story. You know, it's this, we've had this in the past, nothing this drastic, but by no means are we guaranteed that it's never going to happen again. But now let's talk about mini games, right?
yeah.
So I love Malaphone Guild Ball. Obviously you're a Guild Ball Privateer Press fan. I can't, there's modules there's a thing called Vassal that makes it very easy to play Malifaux online. I can't stand it as much as I love Malifaux. I can't stand it. I've played God Tier online and it's fine. I've played Legion online and it's fine. But this has made me realize how much the tactile face-to-face was a huge part of my love of the hobby. In your mind, do you think that there's going to be a hangover for mini games as well?
100%. But also, again, and this is something I've been talking about, how it affects different types of games differently. It also affects different types of miniature games differently, because Games Workshop have I don't think ever been doing better than right now. And to drill into that, it's because Games Workshop was the monolithic entity that existed, and so every other gaming company is, to one extent or another, dependent on Games Workshop, but also set up deliberately in opposition to Games Workshop. So every other company tends to prioritize rules much higher than Games Workshop does, because Games Workshop games, they say themselves, they're a miniatures company. The rules only exist to give you something to do with your miniatures.
Yeah.
And so Games Workshop have been knocking it out the park during lockdown with going, hey, here's a chance to paint up your back catalogue. Here's a chance to start that new army you've always been thinking about. And they can do that because I would posit, right, looking at, say, the four elements of, let's say, 40k. You've got the background, you've got the miniatures, which are stunning, you've got the background, which is incredible, you have the huge and very active community, and you have the rules.
Mm-hmm.
I would posit that probably 0% of 40k players of those four things went, the rules are the reason I'm playing this game.
Oh, no question.
Right? Like,
yep.
And I'm not saying that's not saying the rules are bad or the rules aren't, or people don't enjoy the rules, but the rules are never the reason why people play 40k if you drill down into it.
Yep.
And so Games Workshop has been very well positioned to deal with this pandemic. And also, it helps that they're the biggest player in the industry by a massive margin and blah, blah, blah. Like, they had a lot of fallbacks and contingencies, I assume.
And their supply chain, I think, helps them as well, too.
Yeah,
the fact that they're far more self-sufficient than a lot of others.
Yeah, because their supply chain is almost all internal. Yep. So they're not going, well, the factory in China shut down. We don't know when that's getting back up. And then we don't know how we're going to ship it because the suppliers aren't answering our emails because of COVID, blah, blah, blah. Absolutely. Yep. But that means that stuff like Guild Ball, well, obviously Guild Ball, like Private Press, like Malifaux, because they have put a much higher emphasis on rules, you need to play the games. Like, yep. the model quality is lower, not necessarily because those companies want it to be, but purely because no one can match Games Workshop's model quality. Like, I got the Lumineth box set. One of my friends got it for me as a housewarming present because I was very lucky. I moved into a new house literally 2 days before lockdown started.
Wow.
So we got out because myself and my fiance were in a 1-bedroom flat. And imagine being locked down for 6 months in a 1-bedroom flat. And so one of my friends bought me the Lumineth box as a moving in present. And there are points where I'm pretty sure the sculptors are just showing off. Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm cutting out bits and I'm like, oh, screw you. How did you do that? Like, that's just ridiculous. And so other companies, because the model quality is generally lower, and also other games tend to be smaller. Like, a lot of the games we're talking about, like Malifaux, Guild Ball, God Tier, there are others that I can't remember, are all like more in that skirmish vein, like Infinity as well, much more in that skirmish vein. And so there's less of a buy-in to be like, hey, start a new faction, because starting a new faction is 60 quid rather than starting a Games Workshop army where that's 300-400 quid.
Yep.
Minimum.
Yep.
And so I think, as you say, there are a lot of ways of playing online, like Tabletop Simulator has been getting very popular, and Vassal, obviously, but I'm the same as you. I played a bunch of Vassal, and it doesn't scratch the itch. It doesn't turn on that same part of my brain that goes, oh, I can play this game. I can beat my opponent. It's just like, it feels much more like I'm just like, yeah, click, click, blah, yeah, I guess it's fine. And so I think miniature games, Games Workshop was always the biggest player in the industry, and I think they are only going to get stronger off of this because their sales have been extraordinary and have probably gone up, if anything, during coronavirus. Whereas I think every other company is going to be in much more trouble.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, Bryce. Interesting to see companies that were struggling to begin with. There's some timing issues too. Like, I feel bad for Corvus Belli because they're supposed to be unleashing this brand new version of Infinity, and of course, now they're going to do it in this thing. And I know Privateer Press was kind of unleashing a new version of War Machine with a different angle, and this kind of squash it. I don't know, it'll be interesting. Same from the board game perspective too. Though the one thing that's nice about board games, and I had this conversation with a buddy of mine, is I can buy a board game today and sit down with my wife or the 3 other couples that we have, have trusted to spend time with because of the protocols they follow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't socialize that way with people that play mini games. My wife is not going to play Marvel Crisis Protocol with me. So that changes things a little bit.
I actually was reading an article, I think about this today, where board games, there's the thing where board games are much more innately, you buy the board game and 90%, like, if you're like most board gamers, 90% of the time, the board game sits on a shelf.
Yep.
And you play it maybe once a month, tops. And that's if it's one of your favorite board games.
Yep.
But from the board game company's point of view, they don't really care. They made a game in a box, you bought the game in a box. If you play it and like it, that's great, and tell your friends. But ultimately, they've sold you the product and you have the product. Miniature games have to, by their nature, constantly expand. And that means you have to keep buying things. It's a much harder beast to make. Like, if you think of miniature games that are profitable, and I mean really make a lot of money, you're talking Games Workshop, so 40k Fantasy, FFG, so X-Wing, or maybe Armada. I think it makes slightly less money. It's not as big, but it's expensive. And the final one is Marvel Crisis Protocol.
Yep.
Like stuff like Guild Ball, stuff like Malifaux, the smaller ones, even War Machine now, those games don't make a lot of money. Like they make a profit, they make enough to kind of pay for themselves, but they don't make a lot of money. And by the nature of war games, they have to expand. So over time, they get more and more expensive. By the nature of miniature games, they get more and more expensive, and that gradually the cost and the profit slowly gets eaten away unless your sales are also constantly increasing. The final point on board games versus miniature games, because I do think board games are doing quite a bit better in COVID than miniature games, is, as you say, you usually have a small group of maybe 8, let's say 8 people, absolute tops, that you consider close enough friends. Maybe it's your family and one other family, and you feel safe enough to interact with them during COVID. And you can play board games with them because it's usually families, whereas miniature games tends to be, it's a very competitive game, so you need a much larger gaming circle generally to sustain it, which is usually up to about 20, 25 people, which in the state of COVID is not a group you can vouch for. And there are bound to be people in that group of maybe 25 that you're like, nah, I don't trust that you're doing, I don't trust that you're going to wear a mask and you're going to do all the right things, And so board games tend to be more intimate, I guess, is my point, than miniature games.
Yeah, I can tell you right now, Bryce, even if Tuesday Night Gaming opened up at my game shop again, and I would go every Tuesday night, I'd go and I'd play something. I played Malifaux, Marvel Crisis Protocol, or whatever. If they started doing it right now, I wouldn't go. For the exact same reason that you're talking about. Guys, we're going to take a quick break. When we get back from this break, I want to learn a little bit more about Bryce's perspective on miniature games, kind of where they were, where they are now, and some of the things that he thinks could be changes that we see, some trends from a design perspective. So we'll be right back.
If you're an athlete, you know the greatest motivator of all is the fear of letting your teammates down. After all, a team is only as good as its weakest link. So you owe it to those wearing the same jersey as you to be your best every time you step on the field. That's why there's no vape in team. When you vape, you can expose your lungs to toxic chemicals that can damage your lungs. If you're a step behind, the team's a step behind. Brought to you by The Real Cost and the FDA.
Howdy friends, Greg here. Nothing makes Malifaux easier than having the right tools. Here at the third floor, we love all the licensed Malifaux goodies from Custom Meeple. Not only are they helping support this podcast, they sell custom-made weird licensed tokens and terrain. They sell it all. Crew boxes, terrain, markers, tokens, and even a 3x3 full Malifaux board. Custom Meeple sells a complete M3E token set covering every marker and token you need to play. Custom Meeple are the source for the official accessories for Malifaux. Everything is designed by hand and authorized by Weird Games. Check them out at custommeeple.com, that's with one M, or follow the link in the show notes. Up your Malifaux game and be sure to tell them Craig from the third floor sent you. If you use the promo code Third Floor Friend, all one word, THIRDFLOORFRIEND, you'll get a 5% discount and help support the podcast. It's valid on everything except retail products and playmats. So we kind of hinted at it before the break, Bryce, that we've got quite a journey happening here with miniature games. And, when you got started, when I got started, which is much earlier than you did because I'm older than you. But we've seen really an arc. And I'd be curious to know what you see, and maybe you even have to think about it pre-COVID. What do you see kind of the industry? So the mini game as an overall industry, do you see it moving in a different direction? So, had COVID not happened, or maybe as time passes off, what do you think was 6 months from now, a year from now? What are some trends that you noticed?
So one of the biggest trends has been a blurring of the lines between board games, card games, and miniature games. And I think you see that with, for instance, God Tier from Steamforged Games, because it's marketed and sold in that sort of board game style. I mean, it started originally much earlier, though, with X-Wing. I actually think was one of the first ones to do it, where you buy the starter set and it's like a game in a box, and it comes with absolutely everything, all the tokens, everything. Whereas traditionally for miniature games, you would have to buy all the tokens and stuff separately.
Yep.
Like I'm thinking about War Machine particularly. There was a huge side market for companies that make like licensed tokens and stuff. And X-Wing sort of started with that, and Armada with FFG. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that going forward, because miniature games are traditionally, apart from Games Workshop, which is always a sort of outlier in everything, because it's the biggest player in the industry, and I don't think anyone is ever going to touch Games Workshop. FFG managed to get to a similar sales level with X-Wing, but they don't have anything like that, the terms of the community, painting, because all of their stuff is pre-painted as well, which is another huge factor for getting board game players in. And also the fact that they all of their games use custom movement widgets, because when you're trying to get board gamers to play miniature games, which board gamers are a much bigger market, one of the things that often puts people off is free movement and having to, like, standing around with a measuring tape or widgets and measure your movement. And personally, that's one of the things I love about miniature
Right.
games. Yeah, but I am aware that makes me, in terms of the market, very much in the minority. And so board gamers want everything they need in that box. And I really think you're going to start seeing that is already the biggest trend in the market. And even, for instance, CMON with A Song of Ice and Fire, you saw the same thing. Custom movement widgets, custom dice, custom everything that you need all in a box. And one of the more interesting games that I think has come out recently is Warhammer Underworlds, because it is a weird sort of blend of, like, I would argue it's more of a card game than a miniature game.
It's a collectible card game. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, because they also went for the FFG model of, if you want to play competitively, you have to buy every box. And I did play during the first 2 seasons of I want to call it Shadespire because that's what it was called. And then they were like, actually, the real name's Warhammer Underworlds. And I'm like, nah, Shadespire's a better name, lads. So I played heavily during the first 2 seasons, and I actually won a Grand Clash back years ago. But I got out of it because it was the collectible card game model, where I was like, I started looking at every new release. Instead of a release, I saw another little blip, and there were going to be little blips every month where I was going to, if I wanted to keep playing this game, I was going to have to spend 20 quid a month in order to stay in. And if you get out of it, because I took a break from what I intended to be a break from the game, and then 6 months later I was like, God, I need to spend 100 quid if I want to get back into this. And it really put me off. But I think the game itself is actually a very interesting blend of, and it's Games Workshop going for the card game market. And they market it as the ultimate competitive miniatures game, which I think is very funny because it's not a miniatures game and it's not the best miniatures game in the world.
Right.
Because there are 3 separate points of variation in that game with your power deck, objective deck, and dice, compared to something like War Machine or Guild Ball, where traditional games only have 1 point of variation. Not to say it's a good game, because it is, and I very much enjoyed playing it. But so I think you're going to see a lot more blending of traditionally separate styles of games. And I think Underworld is a big sign of it. God Tier is a big sign of it. A Song of Ice and Fire, everything FFG do. Because FFG have inserted themselves into the miniature game market by having Star Wars.
Right.
At the end of the day, you can strap just about anything and put you can strap a Star Wars license to literally anything, and you're going to make money.
Yep.
And it lets them artificially kind of instantly insert themselves into a market in a way that no other miniatures game has been able to achieve, except Marvel Crisis Protocol.
I was just about to say that's the other license that's big enough now too. Yep.
Yeah. And again, Marvel Crisis Protocol uses a lot of the same stuff FFG does, because it doesn't use measuring tapes. It uses like its own movement widgets. It uses its own
dice.
And the move away from standard D6s is actually something that's been coming for a while. And I think like that is a much more common part of miniature games than it was 10 years ago. And I think that will continue to be a more common part, is using your own custom dice, because they let you do things in ways that normal D6s don't, and they aid player interaction, even if, because so in Shadespire, it could be that like a 6 is a crit, a 4 or a 5 is a hammer, a 3 is a sword, a 1 is a whatever.
Right.
But by putting your own system on there, you aid player legibility, because it's easier for a casual player to just pick up, and instead of having to whip up like a table or something in a book, you just go, I rolled a hit, that's good. And also, side point, it lets you make lots of your own custom dice and sell them that no one else is making.
Yeah, and I would imagine that from a design perspective too, it opens up something too, right? So you can only redesign a D6 so many times. It's 1 through 6. Whereas if you've got dice, you've got a new potential mechanic. And that's actually where I want to talk a little bit, Bryce. So let's go back to the movement widgets, right? So you've got not just movement widgets, but let's look at like, say, God Tier Shadespire, right? Where you've got the hexagonal limited movement, you have board spaces, right? Or you go to Legion, Marvel Crisis Protocol, X-Wing, where you've got widgets that limit the movement. From a design perspective, what is good about that? Like as a designer, what makes you go, oh, thank God we're going to go this direction? And what is something that you worry about as a designer? But let's focus on what you like it. If someone said to you, Bryce, I need you to design this game, my only requirement is it's going to be a hexagonal board or it's going to use these widgets. What does that offer you as a designer?
So if we take the 3 points of the compass on this one as free movement, widget-based movement, and hexes, like the 2 extremes, free movement gives you free movement, right? Like the strengths of that are it aids player positioning, and it makes positioning one of the most skillful elements of any game it's part of, right? And that appeals to a certain potential part of people. The downside is that it feels you get to situations where people are like, I'm 0.1 of an inch out of this measurement. It also leads to movements where models on a tabletop inevitably are going to get knocked. They're going to get like you're going to put a fist down on one of them at some point, and you're going to have to be like, this was somewhere in this area, and just sort of hope that you're putting it down.
And it's important, as we've already said, right?
Exactly, because free movement is, in any game free movement is part of, movement is, I mean, actually, no, in any game, movement is one of the most important things, right? But in free movement games, it takes on an extra level of skill and of planning around what your opponent's doing and planning around threat ranges. And that can sometimes lead to analysis paralysis, as a term we use, where you don't want to walk into your opponent's threat ranges, and that's been made worse in some ways by the fact that basically every miniature game that uses free movement now uses pre-measuring, which I think is overall a positive because it does mean you're not ever in those feel-bad situations where you positioned 1.1 of an inch out of an enemy model and it's like, oh, well, I suck, I lose.
Yeah.
The final point of free movement and pre-measuring is that the downside is that you sometimes end up in a situation where you're just spending all of your time measuring your opponent's threat ranges and staying out of them, and that can often lead to very unfun game states. Widget-based movement is a sort of a hybrid territory in the middle, where movement is free to an extent because you're using widgets, and so each model, instead of having literally infinite ways it can travel around, because it can go to any of the 360-degree points of the compass, a model can only maybe has 5 points at which it can travel. So it cuts down on analysis paralysis a lot in that regard, and it makes player choice a lot easier. It's also much less intimidating because for a lot of newer players and a lot of board game players, they look at free movement and they go, I don't know where I'm supposed to go. There are so many, the potential options, as I say, are literally infinite. Whereas by reducing the number of options, you actually in some ways increase player choice because people prefer. I was reading this really interesting psychological thing today, that if you give people in a supermarket 24 types of, let's say, jam, they are way less likely to buy something than if they only have a choice of 4 types of jam. And I think that's really interesting because that's where the big benefit of widget-based movement comes in. And also, in some regards, it's cleaner because, you're not trying to measure a tape measure over the table and going, yeah, this is roughly 6 inches, and so it's good in that regard. And also, I think the coolest part of games that use it are games that use like custom ones and use that very heavily to push the game. X-Wing being a really good example, or Star Wars Armada being a really good example.
Yep.
Hexes are the best option in terms of cleanliness of play, because if a model is in a hex, it's in a hex. If it gets knocked, you know it was in that hex, right? So it is very, very clear and simple and easy to understand for new players. The downside is it is the most constrained of all the options because, you can move through, say, 3 hexes in any direction, and so there are more options than under a widget-based system, but ultimately the finer points of this is an inch here or an inch there, it doesn't matter. It's you're in a hex or you're out of a hex. It's a very binary system in that regard.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too, and I would imagine as a designer, this is important because I know that I'm trying to think of the term I've heard where you have a certain amount of currency as a designer, right? So as rules, and you have to decide where you're going to complicate it and where you're going to oversimplify, because you only have a certain amount of currency you can spend.
Yeah.
You can't just make everything complicated because you're going to end up with a shitty game, and you can't make everything too simple because you'll end up with a shitty game as well. So you've got to figure out where to spend that, right? And I would imagine that the difference between a hex movement is 1 page in the rule book, and free movement is 7 pages in a rule book.
Yeah.
And that matters, right?
Yeah, like that's a huge factor. And I guess I've been talking about it more from player experience point of view, but yes, you're absolutely right. Describing a model can move 3 hexes in any direction is much simpler than trying to describe that a model can move up to its maximum value in any direction. And like, especially when you get into terrain, is actually the key point there, because terrain in free movement systems almost always sucks.
Yep.
Like, it's really hard to make terrain that is both relevant and interesting and not overwhelming. And how models of free movement interact with terrain is like, those are often the bits of rulebooks and for free movement games that take up a vast amount of space for what is technically not really much of a gain in terms of does this make the game fun? Whereas with hexes, if there's terrain in this hex and you're in this hex, you get X effect. Or you just can't go in this hex because it's terrain. And that's a very simple method.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, obviously, for me, the hexes take away part of the experience, but
Yeah.
that's also, the fact that, I've been playing war games for a very long time, right? So I'm set in my ways. I long jumped that hurdle of free
Hmm.
movement. And
Hmm.
now I'm very familiar with it. When I went from 40K to Guild Ball, I was like, okay, yeah, I know how to do this,
Yeah.
but if Guild Ball was my first game, it'd be like, whoa, like I can go anywhere. That's crazy, So I'd already fought that battle. So I'm going to try to figure out how to phrase this or to ask this question, Bryce. In your mind, would you be better off investing in tape measures or in hex boards? If you're an investor right now, which direction do you think we're going? Do you see us going more to the constrained movement, or do you think it's going to swing back again? We're going to see more free movement, or is it going to be balanced the way it is now? Is there enough desire for both?
So I think if you look at almost every new game that's come out in the last 5 years, uh, I can't think of one that uses free movement, like completely free movement. So generally speaking, there is a big trend away from that in the industry at the moment. However, gaming, like most things, is cyclical. I suspect that you're going to see in the next maybe few years still, and I think COVID obviously is going to have a massive effect of just shutting things down for the foreseeable future because it's very difficult to develop and test a game, particularly a miniatures game. Like a board game, I can test in my living room, right? If I have to test a board game, it's harder trying to test 2 or 3 or 4 player versions. But
Yep.
ultimately, I can do it on my kitchen table and I can sort of figure it out. Miniatures games, you pretty much need another person there to do any real testing, and so that's another way in which miniature games are hamstrung by COVID. But generally speaking, there was a huge trend away from free movement, and I think in the short term, you're not going to see any more free movement games, at least none that make a big impact.
Right.
However,
Some indie games might do it, but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, indie games might do it. However, give it 5 years,
Hmm.
10 years, then a lot of people are going to go, oh, there's not a lot of free movement games in the market. Maybe this is now an angle that we can approach and go for the free movement gamers. So unhelpfully, I think both are going to be seen, but I think in the short term that we are absolutely never like we're not going to see any big free movement games in the short term. And I can't wait for this podcast to come out and then the day after that a brand new like Marvel free movement game or something's going to come out.
That's pretty much how it always works.
Yeah.
So before we leave talking about just miniature games, the one thing that I'd be curious to know is, you have been a part of designing more than one game. And there's different aspects I'm learning as I talk to designers. There's different aspects of design. And I'd be interested, what part do you like the most? Is it the meta concepts? Is it balance? Is it mechanics? Is it translating lore into mechanics? Like if someone were to say, Bryce, what is your favorite thing? What do you get most excited about when you're designing a game? Is there a certain part of that excites you the most?
Yeah, there's a lot that so designing a game or developing a game from scratch, there's one of my favorite things is when you first see the concept or something for the game and you see the very initial sort of rough scratch, like what we call like the napkin. You know what I mean? Like you get handed a napkin by your designer and he goes, I think this is good. Make
Yeah.
make this. And there's a point where you take that very rough concept and your brain starts fizzing and you're like, I can see what this can be. And that is a really beautiful feeling that where you kind of you see the seeds and you know that you're going to make an oak tree out of it, you know.
Right.
And that's really just a good feeling. And then the other part is, yeah, I would actually really say that one of the most fun parts of developing stuff is when you get to take something from lore and figure out how to put it in the game in a cool way. Because that
Yeah.
feels very, very satisfying. Like if you get it anything even close to right, that's always the stuff you get the best responses from the community on. So yeah, that's just an awesome feeling when you get to put something from the lore in.
Yeah, it's neat. It's something that I loved about Guild Ball, and part of what I really love about Malifaux. And quite frankly, it's kind of what I'm digging about Marvel Crisis Protocol too. Is that, I mean, each of those games feel like Guild Ball felt like the books and the stories I read. Malifaux feels like, you know, that, and I feel like I'm playing superheroes when I'm playing Marvel Crisis Protocol. So, guys, we're going to take another break. When we get back from this break, I want to talk about something I actually have not broached on this podcast before, but Lord knows you get 5 gamers together and the subject will come up. But I want to talk to Bryce about playtesting. So we'll be right back. Howdy, friends. Here on the 3rd floor, you'll find us playing Malifaux and other tabletop games using Mats by Mars. Their mats are scratch-resistant, waterproof, wet erase marker compatible, and lighter than neoprene. Their mats use a new material that eliminates almost all glare, which is perfect if you're filming battle reports or you're under some glaring lights. Mats by Mars gives you over 40 designs to choose from. Pick a mat size, pick a print or design, and then choose an overlay for Marvel Crisis Protocol, Star Wars Legion, or even Malifaux 3rd Edition strats and schemes. The overlays will speed up your deployment and the placement of all of your objective markers. Until the end of September 2020, you can use the new promo code 3rdfloor920 to get a 10% discount on your next order. The promo code is in the show notes. When you place your order, don't be afraid to tell Mats by Mars you'd like a 3rd Floor Wars logo to be put on your mat at no charge. It's the only way to make the best mat in the market even cooler. Again, use the promo code 3rdfloor920 to get a 10% discount. All the details are in the show notes. So I kind of dipped into it a little bit with Bryce talking about what's the most exciting. I have been told off the record by a few designers that playtesting is a brutal process. But boy, oh boy, is it a necessary process. And if you sit down somebody and you ask them, you know, where did this game go wrong? Guarantee the topic of playtesting is going to come up. Anytime a new edition comes out, playtesting is going to be a subject. Anytime a new wave of models comes out, playtesting is going to be a discussion. So Bryce, I'm not quite sure where to even start. Let's start with something simple. From a design perspective, what is the goal of playtesting?
So that's a difficult question because there are multiple types of playtesting, is the answer. There is the playtesting you do initially when you have a concept to make sure that the concept functionally works. And at that point, you have to literally turn 90% of your brain off. The part of your brain that's going, oh, that's really overpowered, that's silly, that is absolutely irrelevant, right?
Yep.
The point of initial playtesting is this functional? Does this do what I want it to do? And that's let's say the first 10% of testing you do on a game. The next part is probably 70% of testing, and it kind of goes throughout all of the aspects of testing, but it's the biggest and the absolute most important part, which is the game fun? You are testing to see if the game is enjoyable. Because people get so hung up, and it's one of the things actually that is makes it quite hard to find playtesters sometimes, is people see the word playtesting and they either home in on the play part or the testing part. And it's like, no, you're doing the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
So that means you can't just approach playtesting as if you're just playing a normal game with your friends, because that's not the point. You also can't approach playtesting from a purely mechanical, this is a test, I will bash numbers into a spreadsheet until numbers come out.
Right.
Most of what playtesting is making sure that the game is fun. Because if the game's not, a game can be wildly unbalanced, right? Like some of the best games out there, like board games particularly, but also I think you can say whatever you like about 40k or fantasy. Balance is
fun.
It's fun, right?
Yeah.
And balance is not the most, and this is going to annoy a lot of people, balance is not the most important thing in any given game. The most important thing is if you enjoy the game. Balance testing is probably the last 10 to 20% of the testing you do, And balance testing is the thing that people think of when they think of the word playtesting.
Right.
But balance testing is a a minuscule part at the end of all of your testing. Once you've got the game working, once you know what all the mechanics go like, once you know how the overall game engine functions, and once you've got the game feeling fun, then you start worrying about balance. And people drastically overestimate how much of testing is balance testing, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's what nobody talks about the other aspects of it. That tells you right there, right?
Yeah.
The only discussion that's had by people outside of the glass is the balancing aspect. So let's talk about is it fun? How does that happen? So I as I've talked to different designers, Bryce, one of the things that I've heard is a common thing is many of the designers I talk to have kind of their secret group, their hand-picked playtesters that they really trust.
Mm-hmm.
And they usually aren't trusted for the same reasons. So there might be 7 people, right? And you trust Billy to be able to figure this out and to give you good feedback here. Mm-hmm. And Sally and Jim, when they play the game, are going to give me strong feedback on this aspect of playtesting. How do you gauge fun as part of that?
That's probably the hardest thing to do as a developer. Ideally, you have to be exposing new people to the game. So ideally, you would be bringing in different people at different stages of the playtest process. And so you might have your people that you trust very much at the start of the playtest process, and you're going, look, this is rough. Don't worry about balance. Just playtest it a bit. Tell me what you enjoy. Tell me what you don't enjoy. And then close to the end of playtesting, you'd be bringing in people who maybe don't playtest all that much. Yeah. Ideally, often what you want is people who've never playtested before. Ideally, people that don't play games all that much. Mm-hmm. And you want to just sit them down. And part of it is you want to show them the rulebook and see if they can figure it out, which is one thing that is one of the most valuable things you can do if you're designing a game, is when you're very close to the end and you're almost ready to lock it, bring in someone that's never seen anything to do with the game, show them the rulebook and ask them how to play the game. And if they can figure it out from the rulebook, brilliant, you're spot on. If they can't, then you need to fix the parts that they can't figure out. But you need to watch them play, and there's a spark, right? And it's very hard to describe, but there's a spark when people get a game. And often it's a very small thing. It's something like they'll go to move a piece, and while their hand's in the air, they'll put it back down and they'll go, wait. And they'll think about it. And you're like, you're in. I've got you.
Hook set.
Yeah, exactly. And really, it's just about exposing the game to as many people as you can within the playtest process and asking them what they enjoy. And it's something that's incredibly important to test, because as a developer, the game loses all meaning as a game. Particularly when you've been working on the thing for like 5 months and you're so bored, and you just because I got to a point where I was testing, and that actually leads to an interesting point, because I got to a point with Dark Souls card game where I was testing that game mostly by myself at that point. And so I got to a point where I was like drawing a card and I just knew the mathematically correct thing to do in almost every situation. And so that actually led me to, in the expansions, make them harder, because I thought the game was super easy. And then when I put the expansions out to playtesters, the first time I put it out, someone was like, this is literally impossible. We've died 40 times. We can't beat this. And I'm like, oh, I thought that was really easy. Right. I need to adjust this down a little bit.
Yeah. Your blinders are on at that point, I imagine.
Yeah. And it's partially because you can very easily get too deep in the game, and you're only seeing the mathematical elements.
Yeah.
And there's also, frankly, an element of boredom. Like, people think game development is the most fun game and the most fun job in the world, and it's just playing games all day. And some days, yes. Other days, you're populating a spreadsheet of 280 cards, and other days you're making 150 edits to those 280 cards. And anyone who's worked on a project at work, and I imagine there's a lot of people out in the world, when you've been working on a project for 4, 5, 6 months, maybe a year in some cases, by the time it gets to the end of that project, you're done. Like,
Yeah.
you just want to see the back of it. And so that point particularly is where it's so important to bring in other people and get them to playtest it. A, because you get different feedback, but also as a developer, that can actually be really rejuvenating because you've been so deep and you've had your head buried in this thing for so long that you've stopped seeing the game and you're just seeing numbers. And then you watch people play it and you go, oh, this is a game. They're enjoying it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, this is fun, right? Yeah, brilliant. And it gives you like new heart to go and work on the game again.
I bet. Now, I'd be curious. Let's say that you do a play test, and this you might have an example of this. You do a play test and you realize this is not as much fun as I thought it was, right? So you've gotten some feedback, you've watched a game or two with play testers, you decide fun is an issue. I need to make this more fun, or there's aspects that are not fun. How do you set the hounds to figure out what needs to change to make it fun? Is it just so different on every game, or are there certain things that you look for or that can cause a game to be less fun than you'd want?
So it is different in every game is the short answer, because there's a vast array of difference between something not being fun in a miniatures game and something not being fun in like a card game or a board game.
Right.
But generally speaking, there will be some mechanic or some aspect of the game that people aren't enjoying, and it can often just be something that feels, the term we use is clunky. So something that feels like what you want from a mechanic is for it to be so smooth that it doesn't feel like a mechanic. And when a mechanic is clunky, it is pulling you out of your immersion in the game and forcing you to go, oh, I am playing a game right now, and the game is making me do this thing. And so really it's about looking at the aspects people enjoy, looking at the aspects people don't enjoy, and tweaking the aspects they enjoy so that they're more like the aspects they do enjoy, and so that the aspects that they don't enjoy fit more smoothly and integrate more smoothly into the primary aspects, which are the parts that people are enjoying.
Yeah, the more invisible, the better in some ways, I would imagine, right?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's something that we have to do, which some people call killing your darlings or murdering your darlings, which is it's very easy to get attached to certain things. And sometimes that thing, even if it's a good mechanic, it doesn't fit in this game. And you have to take it out. Like, you just have to be like, right, I love you, I'm so sorry, and then you load the shotgun, you know? Like,
well, and I've heard from a few people that a lot of times those things are the things that may have been the genesis of the idea to begin with. Like the game was born from that idea, but as the game has changed over the process of designing it, you realize it doesn't belong here anymore, even though it may have been the mother or the father of the idea itself, which has got to be a challenge. So Bryce, imagine that someone approaches you and says, look, I just started my own gaming company and we're going to do play testing for the first time. Do you have any advice, any common mistakes that you would give to that person? What are lessons you've learned in the process, or what you see as common mistakes that maybe a rookie game company might make?
So I think the initial mistake is the biggest mistake people would make is the one that I've already covered, where they put way too much focus on balance testing to the exclusion of anything else, because ultimately you can have the most perfectly balanced game in the entire world. If it's not fun, no one's going to play it.
Yep.
And so that's honestly the single biggest point. The second point would be get different people to look at your game throughout testing, because there is a fatigue factor that your playtesters, plus you're asking your playtesters generally to give their time for free. Or maybe they get a copy of the game or whatever when it's done. And so if it's an expensive game, they're maybe effectively working for like £2 an hour or something, you know?
Yeah.
And because playtesting make or break a game, you ideally need to spread the load, and you also need to introduce other people at different stages, because otherwise, if someone's with it from the start, they risk doing the same thing that any developer can do and getting too deep in the game and not seeing the overall picture. The final point, the final mistake is this is mostly for miniatures games, but I think it also applies to board games as well. But get players of different skill levels.
Oh, good call.
One of the most important things, right? Because one thing, and I think there's a perfect example, which is Games Workshop with 40k 8th edition versus 9th edition. So in 8th edition, they simplified the rule set drastically. They cut out a hell of a lot of stuff. They drastically simplified the cards. They made it way more streamlined to play. And people got mad and cried out for like a lot of the rules weren't fully thought out or like weren't as clear as they could have been. And going into 9th edition, from the rules sort of stuff we've seen so far and the rules that they've shown, the initial response has been very bad because they're releasing these like paragraphs of text that are very dense, and it's like the hell. Like there was one on terrain that I do this professionally, and I got halfway down the paragraph and my eyes just blurred and I couldn't see anything, and I was like, right, okay, I'm not reading that.
Yeah.
And what I think that has been is that all of their playtesters are very competitive players, right? Who are so deep in 40k and live, breathe, and sleep 40k. And those playtesters, because they know exactly what that rule is meant to do, and they are so deep into this mindset of 40k competitive play, they've looked at that paragraph of text and gone, this is brilliant, this is very, very clear, this is very prescriptive, I love this, this means there's absolutely no room for interpretation. And yeah, brilliant, but 99% of the 40k market is not competitive tournament gamers.
Yep.
So you have to make the game for the people that play it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think in anything for a miniatures game, you have to have players of different skill levels, because they would have picked up on that. And if you're sending your competitive players something and they're going, right, this rule's really clear, brilliant, lock it, done, and you send it to your lower skill players or your players that maybe don't play as regularly, and they look at it and they go, what the Christ is this?
Yeah.
Is there a translation tablet for this? You know what I mean? Like, and so at that point, you would pick up on that as a developer and you would change the rule. And the competitive players would bitch and whine.
Yep.
But ultimately, it's not their, like, I was going to say it's not their game. Like the whole Warhammer's for everyone, it's everyone's game. But ultimately, if you have a rule that is benefiting 10% of your players and making life more difficult for the other 90%, that's a bad rule. Like, you have to just make it simpler.
Yeah, even if it, I mean, I think one of the traps that I've seen, and I put in, I think it's one of the challenges Infinity faces, and it's what I like about the design of Marvel Crisis Protocol. So I see those two games as two very much of the extremes on this idea, and that is the idea of trying to be a simulator. Right. So Infinity, I mean, the rules are just, I mean, it's paragraphs and paragraphs, and they're trying to really kind of simulate real life on a 3x3 board. You know, from the terrain to the timing to the interrupt this and dodge that and roll around here. And then you go to the other extreme with Marvel Crisis Protocol, and they're like, look, terrain is a size, right? That's a size 4 building. And because it's size 4, this is what it does. And there's no elevation in the game. Everything is top down. So if I'm at the bottom of a building and you're 3 stories up, but you're still 2 inches from me from the top down, you can still punch me. And when I first saw that with Marvel Crisis Protocol in that direction, I was like, whoa, like what's going on here? And it really kind of put me off a little bit until I played like 2 games. Yeah. And after 2 games, I was like, this is so easy. Like I'm like, it took me 40 minutes to play this game because it's just like, yeah, this is what we do. And this is easy. I don't have to pull the rule book out every time. I don't have to measure it 16 different times. And do I go a half an inch this way or half an inch that way? One last thing on playtesting, Bryce. Now there's obviously the artificial constraint of the company that says, look, you need to stop playtesting because we got to put the damn thing out.
Yeah.
But outside of that, when do you feel like as a designer, if it was completely up to you, you'd be like, okay, we're done with this. Now we need to release the game, not put it in open beta. I'm talking about actually release the game. Is there certain benchmarks that you have in your head that tell you that it's time to stop playtesting and release it?
Given a choice, I would still be testing every game I have ever made.
Yeah.
This is one point where developers particularly need external deadlines because we generally tend to be perfectionists. I think is fair to say. Like, you want to get every single niggle, you want to get every single little thing perfect, and ultimately there comes a point where the game is probably 95% of what you've got in your head, and you have to look at, well, so there's a timing cost thing where, like, is it worth me spending, because let's say the 95% took me 6 months. To get the last 5% is probably going to take another 2 months, and is that worth it from that's 2 months more wages and so on and playtesting budget? But there's also a point where for that last 5%, you're probably not making the game better. You're just making it different, because you, like, knowing when to step away is very, very hard. Like, it's something that is actually, it's why external deadlines are super helpful, because they force you to stop tinkering. Because otherwise, you could tinker forever with any game. You could constantly be changing a number here or there, or adding an ability, taking an ability off, tweaking this, changing that, and ultimately you're probably not really helping at that point.
Right.
But certainly the tendency and the temptation, I think is the better word, is always to do that as much as possible. Where at some point you might actually, the game you had a month ago might actually have been better, but you've just tinkered your way into something different at this point.
What's the term I've heard? You over kneaded the bread, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I can get that. So, guys, let's take another break. When we get back from this break, I want to learn a little bit about kind of behind the scenes about game design. I want to get a sense of what is something that game designers know that we don't, and what are some fallacies that those of us that don't design games believe in that is really not part of the reality. So we'll be right back.
DZ Learguard here, creator of the M3E Crew Builder app, and I'm a patron of Third Floor Wars because supporting great content creators like them is one of the best ways to help grow this game. So to join me and the other floor heads, go to patreon.com and search for Third Floor Wars, and we will see you there.
What is it worth to you to get this podcast on a weekly basis? Is it worth $1 a month, $5 a month, $20 a month? If you'd like to help support the work that we're doing here on Third Floor Wars, please go by our Patreon. We're at patreon.com/Third Floor Wars. There you can pledge at any level, any dollar amount. Whatever you give us will help us put out quality content on a regular basis and hopefully make tabletop gaming a little bit better for you every week. Hey, want to give a special shout out to some of our newest patrons. Special thanks to Mike Schmidt, Peter DeArmas, Eli, Casey Guidewell, Alexander Ebby, The Gazebo Was, Islin, Joe Hatfield, William Majerum, Alan Connell, Sean Fisher, James Whitbread, Nick Cromarty, and Blair Thompson. Because of you guys, we're able to put out content on a regular basis, and we appreciate it. Howdy friend, Craig here. Is this episode making you realize you need to buy some models? Gadzooks Gaming is my favorite online retailer because of their large selection, killer prices, and great customer service. Don't you hate buying an entire crew box when you only need one model? Gadzooks sells crew box models individually and saves you a ton of money. They even have free shipping to the US and Canada if you spend $100 or more. Swing by gadzooksgaming.com and make sure you tell them Craig from the Third Floor sent you. All the details are in the show notes. I chuckle a little bit, being a part of the community all over the world for Malifaux mostly, but with some other things as well. There's a lot of people out there that are really good at designing games, but oddly, they've never done it before. But you ask them, and they're experts on how to design games and what it takes to be a good designer and things like that. I've been around the block enough to know that you don't know anything until you've actually tried to do it. So, Bryce, I've been trying to figure out kind of the best way to crack your head open and learn and pull the curtain aside. So I'm gonna ask you the question this way. Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed kid straight out of school comes up to you and says, "Hey, Bryce, I know that you design games. That's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I just got hired by a company and I'm going to be designing my first game." What are the 2 or 3 things you tell that young lady to say, "Look, here's something you don't know now, but this is something you're going to know a year from now"? What are the 3 things that people that don't design games that they don't know and don't understand?
The first thing I would say to that person is, if you want to make any money, do something else.
That's good advice. Same thing about owning a game shop, right?
The second thing I tell them is, I sort of covered it slightly above, but don't worry about balance. Like, honest to God, balance is, it's not important, but I think it's interesting because I started as a very competitive tournament gamer.
Yeah.
And so I was like, balance is the guiding light. If your game is balanced, they will come. And the longer I work in the industry, balance matters, but it's nowhere near the most important thing. So don't worry too much about it.
Can you think, Bryce, when you turned that corner, is there, I'm sure it wasn't like overnight. I'm sure it was somewhat gradual, but can you think of maybe a landmark that made you realize, what I came in thinking is not the reality, and I need to rejigger the balance in my head.
So it wasn't so much a landmark point. It was more, we had for a while, a couple of years, we had DC David Carroll as our development manager, who has worked on War Machine for a long time, and now is an independent sort of game designer. And he was one of the wisest people I think I've ever met in the industry. And he was the sort of person that gave us a talking to. And I say gave us a talking to, he just showed us, really, and was like, taught us how to be game developers in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think it's so interesting looking back, because I was talking to someone else I worked with recently about how we really disagreed with DC a lot 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and now everything I'm like, yeah, he was right. Yeah.
That's the worst. Can you think of a specific thing that where you made that revelation, something that you thought he was crazy before, but you realized he was right?
I think it was
even conceptually. It doesn't have to be a specific.
Conceptually, it was about whenever we would get like a new concept for a guild in Guild Ball for a while, my head would immediately go to, whenever I saw the very first concept, I would go, "Oh, that's broken. That can't exist in the game." And DC every time would be like, "That is completely irrelevant. We'll deal with that later. That's not the point right now." And it took several iterations for me to get it into my head. But particularly when you're looking at a first draft of something, you're not, like, you have to turn the balance part of your brain off. And he would tell me every time I brought it up, he was like, "No, stop it, turn it off." And I'm like, "Right, okay, yeah, okay, I'm in the room. I'm with you. Yeah, that looks like a really fun mechanic. We can tweak the numbers later." You know what I mean? And you always, I guess one thing as well is you always try and look from you try not to say no as much as possible, because every time you say no, you're limiting your own design space and you're making your job harder. Because then you end up boxing yourself into a little corner and going, everything in this game has to be within this thing. And that's not to say that you can't.
You need limits, right?
You need limits, but one of the most important things as a game developer is you have to know what the rules are so you can break them.
Right.
right? You can't just go in willy-nilly breaking rules all over the place. But if you know exactly the rules down to a T, then you know which ones you can flex. You know where you can color outside the lines a little bit, as it were.
Yep. So I'd be curious, Bryce. I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that designing a game is part creativity and part process, right? There's a process aspect to it, but there's also a creative aspect to it. How does that? How do those relate in your mind? Do you think it's 50% creativity, 50% process, or is it 90% process? And specifically being a good designer, a crappy designer, I don't care what their balance is. So, but in your mind, how much of it is process? How much of it is creativity?
So I usually describe myself as a developer rather than designer, because design is maybe the 5 or 10% at the start of a process that is just coming up with an idea and writing down a very rough concept and some rough mechanics and going, this is a concept, and then you can work on that and you can fiddle it out. But like fundamentally, that's at a stage where literally everything in the game is up for grabs. Nothing is solid. And then most of what I did was development, which is taking that initial rough concept and going, how do I turn this into an actual game that exists in a form that people can play? So sometimes you get just like an A4 page of notes and like a couple of card concepts, and you're like, right, okay, so this card game has 300 cards, so I guess I'll do that now, shall I? But I would say you need to be imaginative and you need to be inventive. If you want to be a designer, imagination and coming up with concepts is by far more important. If you want to be a developer, process is more important, although you do need to be inventive because you need to be able to expand on what's there and sometimes create entirely new concepts, but you're usually working within a framework, and you can create new concepts and add things in and change things around, and sometimes you will go back to the designer and go, hey, I actually had this idea and it's kind of different to what you wanted, but I think it's better. Do you mind if we talk about it? And then sometimes you can change one of the design concepts. But so basically, both are very important. They are different skill sets, and a lot of people in games that play games tend to conflate designer and developer. And I think it's very understandable because it's one of those things where if you work in the industry, it's a reasonably important distinction, and if you don't work in the industry, literally no one cares.
Yeah, no, and I'll be honest with you, Bryce, I don't make the distinction nearly enough. And even though there's a very similar distinction in the line of work that I do, so I should, excuse me, I should have known better. So another thing I've always wondered about is where does your thick shell come from? Where do you put on the armor? The communities are very vocal. They're very critical, and when you have been working on something for 3 months, 4 months, 4 years, whatever, and you put it out there, and I don't care if it's a game that if you press a button, it spits out gold. Someone's going to tell you it's not good. How do you handle that? How do you handle the brutal feedback and just the loud voices that can come at you online?
So it's just partially it's just something you have to learn, because one of the most frustrating things, like we talked about playtesting for a while earlier, and there's something that happens every time you release something, which is you playtest the hell out of it. You playtest it until your eyes are bleeding and you can no longer look at it, and you're like, right, it's done, it's going out, and then on release day, the first comment on the Facebook post is someone going, hey, so if this does this mean this combos with this and I can do this? And you're going, yeah, it does. Great. Thanks. I didn't.
Yep.
Sure. Yeah, go for it. That's brilliant. Yeah. Yep. And then you get people going, oh, how did you not see this in playtesting? And I'm like, I don't know. I had 30 people test that. No one pointed it out. I don't know. And so that's one of the most frustrating things, is where you can, no matter how much you test something, it is on release day, it is exposed to 100 times more people, 1,000 times more people than you could have possibly tested with.
Yeah, all
So,
fresh eyes.
yeah, all fresh eyes, none of whom are tired or working on other things. And so that's just something you have to learn to deal with, really. The thick skin comes from getting online abuse regularly for about 2 years and having it hurt your feelings for a lot of that,
Yeah.
and then gradually the 120th nasty comment is never as hurtful as the first or the 10th. You know, like over time particularly, you tend to just group all of these sort of comments together in your head, and you're like, yeah, fine, just throw another one on the pile,
Yep.
because it hurts a lot at first, and then it's like with anything, right? Anything where you're going to get your feelings hurt. And it's one of the problems in any sort of creative industry, and it's one of the most nerve-wracking things, is that ultimately you are taking something that you have poured your time and effort and your brain power into, and you're saying, this is something I created, and you put it out, and people are going to hate it. Like,
Yep.
some people will love it, some people will hate it, right? That is an inevitability of working in a creative job. And it's just something unfortunately, there's no silver bullet for it. There's no, I mean, if you're feeling vulnerable, or particularly if your mental health is suffering, I would really recommend that if you have just put something out, turn off your phone, turn off Facebook, turn off Twitter, don't look at it, go for a walk, and come back in about 2 or 3 days, because the initial hot takes are going to be a lot angrier than the takes you're going to see in about 3 or 4 days. Because there were models that came out that I've worked on, for instance, where the initial reaction is someone going, this is the most broken thing I've ever seen. You guys are absolute I mean, maybe not that harsh, but you know what I mean? Like,
right.
You guys are idiots. How did this get through testing?
Yeah.
Then a week later, when people have actually tried it, they're going, oh, actually, this is fine. Sorry.
JK. Sorry I made fun of your mother.
Yeah. Sorry. Oh, my bad.
So as far as feedback goes, Bryce, and people, giving their opinions about the work that you've done, is there a certain aspect of it that you consider yourself more sensitive to than another? So if someone comes up to you, I'm getting the impression if someone, says, hey, Bryce, this is broken. You're like, okay, that's balance is something that I've, that is important, but not as important as you think it is. But is there something else, or maybe you can think of a comment or a hot take or something that you went that really kind of disappointed you, and not hurt your feelings, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah. So the example of someone coming up and saying it's broken, like, that is hurtful, more for Guild Ball than anything else, because it was a competitive focused game.
Yep.
Balance is, so I talked about it being maybe 10 or 20%, and Guild Ball balance is maybe 30 to 35%. It's a bigger percentage. For something like Age of Sigmar, balance is in the 0.2% territory.
Yep.
So someone coming up and saying something is broken that sucks. But the worst thing is when someone comes up and says, like, this is trash, I never want to play with it. Or like, I'm just never, this is nothing to me. Actually, no, you're right. There's the worst thing is if you don't elicit any strong response either way. And someone sees something you made and they go, eh. And they never talk about it. Because in some respects, even if someone hates something you've made, they're still spending a lot of time talking about that thing you made, right? Like,
yeah,
that's kind of cool. But
yeah.
if something comes out and it just immediately sinks without a trace, and it doesn't even generate negative feedback, you've gone pretty wildly off the rails somewhere along the line. And that can be, sometimes those are sometimes those are something mistakes that you've made, sometimes it's external pressures. Like,
yep.
One of the hardest things is, like, I've talked about having a hard deadline is often very good for a developer. It can't be too hard a deadline, because sometimes you get a deadline and you're like, oh, this game isn't going to be done. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm going to do my absolute best, but there's a limit to how much work I can physically do in the time I have to work on this.
So if you look back over the last couple of years, Bryce, is there a particular comment, conversation, forum post or something that that really had a good impact on you, that made you just feel good about what you do? Can you think of something that really meant a lot to you that has been said in the past?
I can't really think of any specific. No, I saw a lot of comments when the Shepherd's Guild came out for Guild Ball. It was the last guild ever to be released, and it was kind of my baby. I really because I got to quite rarely. Normally, the concepts for guilds would come down from the design team, and we would develop them. Because I got to basically design the Shepherd's Guild, so I got to do all the backstory for. Well,
wow!
Say all the backstory, what backstory there is. I got to work with the sculptors and help sort of finalize the look of the models. I got to write the character bios and stuff, and so seeing people enjoying them was just really satisfying. But in another way, and this is related to game development, and it's not a topic we've touched on, but it's related to representation in games. And one of probably the favorite comment I've ever seen was when there used to be a rule in Guild Ball called Charmed, which was where a model got a defensive benefit if a model of the opposite, in inverted commas, gender was attacking. So a beautiful female model would get defense bonus against men. And It was a rule that I never liked from when I started playing, because I thought it assumes that everyone's straight, and it's not really appropriate in a very crunchy football-based miniatures game. And so I wrote a post basically saying, we're doing an errata, we're taking this rule out of the game, because it was only on like half dozen models or something as well. So I was like, we're taking it out of the game because we are welcoming of every sort of gender and sexual identity. We don't want to have rules in there that indicate that everyone's straight or only make sense. Like it doesn't really make any sense.
There's no upside.
Yeah, there's no upside, right? Like it was actually proving to be a balance problem, because some models would be too hard to kill against men and too weak against women. And you're like, this is actually a balance problem. In addition to the fact it's just not very representative of gender and sexual identity. And so I made a post about this, and it was fairly tame. I didn't go too far into it, but I said, like, we're welcoming of everyone in the community. We don't want to make anyone feel excluded, and there are people of every sort of gender and sexual identity represented in Guild Ball. And I got a couple of comments from people you wouldn't, like, not white guys, like a couple of trans people, and I think more people from the LGBT community posted comments saying, this is amazing, this makes me feel much more welcome in the community. And I was like, that's honestly, like, that, for all I've worked on a bunch of games, those comments are the ones I'm like, this was a good decision. I am happy with this. You know,
that's a great story, Bryce.
Yeah,
that's a very, very cool story. I don't know. Recently, I've been playing a lot of RPGs, which we already talked about. And I don't play D&D, but you have to keep track of D&D as a role player in the same way as a mini gamer. You have to keep track of GW, right? And what you just talked about made me think about something that's recently happened. Is a young lady, woman, and I'm not sure where she's from. She's on Twitter. She does not have use of her legs. She uses a wheelchair. And kicking around some ideas, she sat down and she designed an item for D&D, which is a battle wheelchair.
Yeah.
So that and I don't know if you've seen this or not, but it has been fascinating to watch, because I was there. I happened to just catch her initial, like, I'm going to think of doing this tweet, all the way to where it is now. And this isn't a matter of, I don't even think it's been a month.
I think it's been like 2 weeks. Like, I've been following it as well. Yeah.
It's incredible. And what's incredible about it for me is, first of all, how awesome, right?
Yeah.
Like for her to have the initiative and to put herself out there the way she has, and to make this thing and put a lot of time and love and energy into it. The reactions have been very fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you've had a lot of the reactions very similar to what you talked about, which is, oh my goodness, this is amazing. and from able-bodied to non-able-bodied, and disabled. I don't know. I'm not good about the terminology. Coming and saying, this is incredible. This is amazing. And then, of course, you've always got the percentage of people who are like, you're ruining my game because of this. But what's really neat is now a sculptor out there said, you know what? I love this idea. And he or she created like 4 CAD sculpts of a barbarian, a cleric, and a thief and stuff in a wheelchair, in her battle wheelchair. And I just saw today that there's 2 different RPG companies that have brought her on as a consultant.
Nice.
To do it. And it's really neat and completely kind of a right term, Bryce, but your little comment there made me think of that. And I can't imagine from your perspective, that must have been very powerful to realize that there was a silence out there and a decision you made broke that silence.
Yeah. Like it's just a really nice feeling to feel like, because the gaming industry has been very monolithic in terms of it's been straight white guys for a very long time, and still is to a very large extent. But we are starting to see those more diverse voices come through, and I think anything we can do to make people feel more comfortable in the hobby is only to the good, right? Like we get more people to play with, and more people feel comfortable and can come in and play games and enjoy themselves.
In the 48 years I've been on this planet, Bryce, there's very, very few things I've learned. And one thing I've learned both personally and professionally is that the more diverse it is, the better it is.
Yeah.
And that is just a truth. And it has been proven to me over and over and over again. The other thing I can tell you that I believe firmly is when something makes you a little uncomfortable, you might be doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. When you feel the pushback, like you talked about, you're probably doing the right thing too. When you feel that resistance, that means that you're doing something. And that can be significant. So let's go put on our tie-dye shirts and go smoke some weed. How's that sound? A nice little kumbaya moment there. So Bryce, first of all, we got to plug this podcast. So talk to me about your podcast.
So my podcast is, as we mentioned at the start, it's called An Eye for Games, I spelled AYE, which was my fiance's idea for the name. And I was just like, yeah, that's brilliant. Like, that's phenomenal. And I basically talk to people from sort of all over the gaming industry about different aspects of tabletop gaming. So the first episode was with 2 game developers I used to work with, about why do people play tabletop games, and we go into how the desire for play is just a very fundamental animal thing, because like every animal, or certainly most of us are higher order animals, plays, right? Like octopus, dogs, birds, primates particularly, and that is something very deep in human nature. And I did a bunch of research, and do you know the oldest ever board game is 5,500 years old?
Is it Go? Is that considered?
It's one from Go is, I think, second or third oldest.
Gotcha. Okay.
It was from ancient Egypt. Yeah. And I just think that's astonishing that like
it is
almost as soon as civilization happened, we were making board games. You know what I mean? I just think that's so interesting.
Bryce, I can tell you, I've listened to several episodes now, and it's an excellent podcast, and everybody needs to check it out on Eye for Gaming, AYE. I really appreciate you coming on, man. It was nice to have your insight as well as your perspective on the entire process from start to finish. And for those of you that stuck around to the end, thanks for listening. Take care. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch so you don't miss the avalanche of content we create. Links are in the show notes. Be sure to check out our shop on thirdfloorwars.com for the latest in gaming apparel and gear. There you'll also find the latest information for the US FOE Tour. Find out where you rank in your conference or even in the entire United States. Get those models built, painted, and ready so we can see you at the next US FOE Tour Masters event. please take a moment to write a review of this pod on your favorite platform. Rating and reviewing helps us find more listeners almost as cool as you are. Be sure to share this feed with all of your friends who love tabletop gaming. Thanks for listening. Howdy folks, Craig here. Now if you love gadgets as much as we do, you're going to love the new Third Floor Wars Gadget Bundle from Schooner Labs. Branded with the logo of your favorite podcast, it comes with 2 measuring multi-tools, a compass stepper for those tight and important movements, along with a compact dashboard to track your turn, strat, and scheme scoring along with your soul stones and pass tokens. It is the perfect bundle for anyone who plays Malifaux or just wants to look cool while doing it. The link is in the show notes. Check them out and help support your favorite gaming podcast. Owning a game shop, right?
Hello?
Did I freeze?
Hello? Yeah, you froze, yeah.
Okay, am I back?
Yes, you were a little bit laggy, but you're back.
All right, well, let's give it a second to catch up. You tell me when it's clear. Is it better now?
Yeah, there we go, yeah.
Okay, good.
You're back now.
All right, so the first thing you tell them, you wouldn't, if you want to make any money in life, don't do this. What's the second thing you tell them?
The second thing I tell them is,
oddly, we've covered a good bit of this too, Bryce. So I expect this won't be the longest segment.
Yeah, I was just thinking I've kind of covered a lot of this in the testing in the previous section.
Yep. So what I'm thinking is let's focus on. I'll throw it to you as I've decided that I'm going to be a game designer. And I've come to you and I said, I'm so excited. This is what I want to do. What are the 3 things you would say to me that say, look, here's what you don't know yet, but you're going to know in about 6 months after doing this. Let's start the conversation there and see where it goes. How's that sound?
Sure.
Good. All right. So here's another perfect example where you just ditch a break, right? Because we ended up going right into blurring the lines.
Yeah.
Which is perfect. It was far more organic than I had planned it, so it's good.
Cool. Yeah, like I was just chatting. Like,
hey, it's good. We're good, man. We've got a good rhythm going. Very anxious to hear what your thoughts here, so I'll bring us back. All right. Out of it, and not on top of it. So, guys, what we're gonna do is Can I continue what I've been doing with this Insider Insight series? And it gives me a chance to talk to game designers and industry. Well, obviously, you and I have trouble having a conversation.
Yeah, we're struggling. Like,
really are. Really are.
Like,
my first segment's usually like 10 minutes, and it was 30 minutes. It makes me really happy. No, don't apologize. It's good stuff.
I did sort of cannibalize slightly stuff that I meant to bring up later, but it was kind of relevant for that. So
that's the whole thing I tried to do.
Do you mind if I have a little cigarette? Just for
not at all, man. Not at all.
Cool.
Yep. That's a big thing for me on this podcast. Is I want it to be conversational, and it's part of why I struggle setting out a call sheet. But people like having that little bit of structure. But I try to tell people we're just going to shoot the shit.
Yeah, I would say like I am stealing this call sheet and using it for my podcast because I've realized that I'm not, I don't structure it enough. Basically, in mine, like conversational is fine, but I need to work harder on actually creating a structure to drive conversation sometimes.
Yes.
Sometimes it gets a little bit stale and I have to jump in and say something. And it's much easier if I can prep that.
That's what I found, Bryce. So I'm a year and a half, 2 years into this. And I completely underestimated the art of hosting.
Yes.
I've learned a lot about it, and it's not as easy as people think it is. It's a real challenge because nobody wants to listen to me talk. right? So I consider an episode successful if I look at my editing board and I've got all the tracks up there, and 3/4 of them are not on my track. The 3/4 of the sound waves are my guests. That I consider a success. But at the same time, you can't just let people talk about whatever the hell they want to talk about. And so when you're hosting, what I've learned to try to do is, I'm going to try to describe this, and it may not connect with you, Bryce, or it may connect with you a year from now when you're doing your podcast, but you have to sit there as the host, but you also have to like sit there as the audience. And you have to listen to it as the audience. And when you start going, this is kind of like, where's this going? Then you've got to come back in as the host, and without being a jerk, you've got to kind of redirect things and move things along. But then there's the other side of that. And I've listened to podcasts where this happens, where the interesting part is not the part that's on the call sheet, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we had 3 paragraphs on the call sheet.
Yeah.
But we talked about some really interesting stuff in that last segment. And you've got to be flexible enough as the host to going, this is good. This is not what I thought we were going to talk about, and not what we're going to talk about right now. But what we're talking about right now is engaging, and it's good. It takes some practice, man. It takes some practice, but it's fun. It's fun.
I should do that. Like, that's a really good idea.
It's good for your guests too. It makes your guests feel like they're in good hands, that you know what you're doing. I have long forgot, because I was a guest on podcasts long before I had my own, and I forgot how kind of anxiety you'd get anxious as a guest, and you don't want to sound like an asshole, and you're being brought on as an expert in something, otherwise you wouldn't be the guest. And just the call sheet just says, "Hey, I got you. This is what we're gonna do." And and I didn't do it with you, but I've got a whole speech that I give at the beginning where I just say, "Look, your job is to talk about whatever you want to talk about. My job as the host is to put us back on track if we get off track, allow us to go if we're going to go. So don't worry about it. Don't edit yourself." And again, it's that I got you. We're good. And then I started using the Squadcast to record for 2 reasons. One, it's recording you locally on yours, recording me locally, and then I mix the tracks, and they're both local tracks. So it sounds like we're in the same room. It doesn't sound like we're talking over Skype or Discord. And 2, I think the video is huge.
It's something I've realized. It's really handy to see people, because you can see like if they want to jump in, and you can sort of end points more naturally. Like, for sure, I think that's definitely. Is this free Squadcast, or is it? It's
not. But I think I want to say it's less than, it's like 30-ish US.
Okay.
And for me, it's well worth it.
Yeah.
Well worth it. But there is one to look at in the meantime if you're not ready to pony up. That's much cheaper, and it's not as good, but it's the same concept, and it's called Zencaster. Zen. Zencaster, and it's good. I stopped using it because it wasn't as reliable as Squadcast, but it's like half the price. And if you can't find it, just remind me, and I'll ping it to you.
Yeah.
But I highly recommend it. But the video is a big deal, I think.
I would agree, and also the fact that like you don't, it's like you're recording a Skype call or something is always much more. It's always way more difficult. It's hard to edit. And whereas this seems like it makes the recording much easier and makes the editing much easier. Rather.
No question. Having both separate tracks are huge, and I don't know if you've gotten into manipulating the audio for clarity and stuff like that, but it's much easier to make me sound good and clear, and then I need to do different things to your voice, right, to make you sound crisp. And you can do that separately on the tracks, and you just bring them together. And if I rip a fart while you're talking, I can just slide that out on my track, and it's not a big deal. So and it also helps when they talk over each other. Yeah, for sure. When you're dealing with it separately. All right, let's actually have a podcast now. For sure. But in all seriousness, no, Bryce, if you ever just want to shoot the shit about podcasting, let me know, because there's a lot of nice people that helped me when I got started, and it's nice just to have somebody go, hey, Craig, what are you doing with this? Or I'm struggling with that. So never hesitate, man.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate the offer. Like,
my pleasure. I appreciate you coming on. All right, so I'll bring us back.
Well, I suck. I lose. Would.
Yeah.
But it does. Completely forgotten the rest of that point.
That's okay. So what we're talking about is so the pre-measuring, what it allows you, the positioning matters everywhere, but it's even more important for free movement. And I think you were heading towards hexes.
Yeah. So the final point of free movement and pre-measuring is that the downside is that you sometimes end up in a situation where you're.
Hey, are you still here? Look, the podcast is over, and you sat through all of the breaks and bloopers? Well, I mean, if you're here, you might as well run over to patreon.com and become a supporter. Don't forget to rate and review this podcast, too, while you're at it, on whatever platform you're listening to. I do appreciate you sticking around. Take care.